All right, here we are back at the My Sugar Free Journey podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Farmer, and I am here today with Dave Feldman. So, this is Dave's second time on the show, but I can almost guarantee you that none of you remember when he was on the first time because I think we had about 6 listeners. He was like the third or fourth episode back then. So he's here, he's back. If you're not sure who he is, you can find his work over at cholesterolcode.com. And I've been following him for years. I'm fascinated by what he does and the work that he does. Siobhan Huggins was on a couple weeks ago, so she's a great she's someone else that's great to listen to. And Dave and Siobhan have worked together for like a year now, year and a half. How long have y'all been working together?
I mean, technically, it's been very, very, very close for about the last year, but it's been a little bit more than that as well. She very quickly jumped on the lipidology train, if you will, that's blasting through and has definitely carved out a lot in her own right, especially on the immune side, which is
fantastic. And she's got great before and after pictures. She looks fantastic. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
So Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right. So you do so much, you do so many of these little N=1 experiments, and all of them I think are just really, really interesting to me. Let's very quickly, because I think a lot of people know your story, but very quickly give us like a TLDR of how you got into this. Why did you start doing this?
Well, I actually was a software developer throughout my entire life. I liked a lot of deep engineering with networks and so forth. And what happened is I had an A1C of 6.1, which is, of course, right in the middle range for pre-diabetes. I had blood markers that showed this. After the second year in a row that I had that, I said, well, I'm going to see what I can do to dodge type 2 diabetes because it's pretty rampant on my dad's side of the family. So I've heard about this low-carb diet, which, believe it or not, I want to say, 4 years ago wasn't nearly at the popularity level that is right now, but was getting used by people who have diabetes to not have diabetes. And pretty quickly, I learned about the keto diet, got into the keto diet, and then about 7 months later, saw that my cholesterol had skyrocketed and freaked out about it. Then started doing a lot of research into the system that moves around our cholesterol, which I'm just going to call the lipid system, and found that it actually looks a lot like a network, something I am very familiar with. And then quickly started doing a series of self-experiments where I found that I can manipulate these numbers substantially by changing around my diet and taking lots of notes, and then sort of slowly but surely getting my way into the low carb community to bring this information to them as well.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much. So let's, so I mean, so much has happened since the last time you've been on, but let's get into some of your experiments that I found most interesting. I think the one that you just finished was a carnivore diet, a meat-based diet. And that was you presented the results of that at CarnivoreCon that just got finished like a week ago. So can you walk us through that? What was the experiment and what did you find?
Well, technically there were 2 attempts at it. I say attempts because both in their own way kind of didn't work, but for good reasons, believe it or not. Well, at least for the first one. So around mid-December of last year, I started the first attempt at the carnivore experiment, and I was going to go for 30 days, pretty much eating bovine meat, as in from a cow, ad libitum. Basically, I was going to have as much as I wanted of steaks and hamburgers and all beef hot dogs, with maybe a little bit of, say, liverwurst and other possible organ meats, but I was going to, kind of play it by ear. And let me tell you, I've done a lot of experiments and have a lot of controversial data. Just the announcement that I was going to do carnivore for an experiment got a surprisingly huge amount of backlash. A lot of people. Really? Yes. In fact, I hadn't known this until I started talking about it, that there were a number of people in the low carb community who aren't very fond of carnivore. which kind of surprised me because really my diet was already around 75% animal-based products. Carnivore was just like, hey, I'm going to go all the way to 100%. So that was one of the first things I learned. But at the same time, there's a whole nother side of a whole nother group of people that are like, I'm just super excited. I cannot wait to see what you say, how you feel and what the effects are going to be and so forth. And I couldn't have been further wrong in my assumption that it was my initial assumption before I started the experiment that it was going to be, as I jokingly call it, a nothing burger. I figured it was going to be like keto, just all meat. Yeah. There really were a lot of differences. So first of all, I cannot stress enough that if you're trying to diet and you have the same experience I did, I found that I really just hardly thought about food at all. That was actually pretty cool. It really was kind of liberating. As I like to say, you don't actually realize how much you think about food until you really aren't thinking about food at all. So right. I didn't think that much about food on a keto diet, or so I thought. But I mean, even just thinking ahead to, hey, when is lunch? Lunch is almost about here. And, we'll probably be eating such and such tomorrow at such and such time. Just lots of those little aside thoughts just hardly occurred to me anymore. I knew when I was going to eat, pretty much close to when it was about time to eat. And I kept eating under my maintenance calories. So I actually had to start eating past satiety to keep from losing weight. And that was kind of a new experience. The other thing that I think a lot of people have already commented on a lot is the lack of GI stress. There's just not as much lower gut anything. Not that was a big problem before, but it certainly is something that I could tell, was just a lot different. Now,
yeah, I had. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but my first kind of foray into the carnivore diet and some of the controversy around it was I had Amber O'Hearn on, and just kind of picked her brain about it. The next week, I had Chris Masterjohn on, and I kind of came to him with some of the things that Amber talked about, and I just wanted to pick his brain about it. Of course, I mean, he's not a carnivore. He thinks you should eat plenty of vegetables and everything. And after that podcast aired, Amber called me back and she was like, why didn't you ask me these questions? I wanted to answer these questions too. So she wanted, I had Amber on like 3 weeks after I had her on the first time, specifically to go over some of the controversies of carnivory. And I found myself kind of in the middle of a controversy that I didn't realize existed. And I didn't, I wasn't aware of all of the, I know eating meat is controversial, but I wasn't aware of everything that was going on kind of in the carnivory circles that I just kind of, I stepped into a pool that was full of sharks I didn't know were there. Anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead and finish.
No, but you know what? I kind of want to expand on that because I think you probably ran into the same thing I did, which is Chris Masterjohn certainly consumes animal products.
Yeah, obviously.
And many people on keto certainly consume animal products. And I do my best. I'm sure you're not too far different. I do my best to sort of avoid the, nutrition battles, if you will. Like I try to be fairly diet agnostic. Right. So of all things, this felt like it wasn't ground where there would be a lot to dispute on between people who already were on like a fairly high animal product plus vegetables diet versus those on an animal only diet. It just seemed like an area that wasn't likely to have a lot of conflict in play. But that was my hard lesson. Just in even announcing this carnivore experiment was that no, there are actually a number of people who are on the keto side of the fence, even if they already have a lot of animal products, who feel very strongly that you do need to be sure that you get enough vegetables. There are a number of things that come from it that you want to have sourced from vegetables and not from animal products. And again, I follow the data. I don't have a huge dog in this fight. But that said, I've now come to recognize that even just in doing experiments alone, there really can be a lot of uproar. And it sounds like you kind of ran into that yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So,
So go ahead.
so what happened is in that first experiment, I didn't really didn't get to really do it ad libitum, because at about 10 days in, I took my lipids and I found surprisingly my triglycerides were extremely high. And
Okay.
I detail this in both of the recent presentations, both at Carnivore Con and at Low Carb Denver. But effectively, what I call this now is the triglyceride carryover effect. And what I mean by that is what it seemed to be is that while I was on the carnivore diet, my triglycerides postprandial, which is to say just following a meal, were not elevated in the way that we would expect. We would expect them to be elevated, but that they were not coming back down. And why I call it carryover is because it seemed to be that it would go into when I went to sleep. I would go to sleep, wake up the next morning, and they would still be elevated as though it was still just immediately following my meal. But by 12 hours fasted, every single time it was below 100. So that very first time it started out at, I want to say 220 milligrams per deciliter was what I woke up with. And that was at 8 hours fasted. But 4 hours later, it was under 100. And I then repeated this several times over, tweaking and changing different things. But the short version of the story is I found that no, actually if you can put on a scatter plot and you can see my triglycerides are all over the place right up until I get to close to about 12 hours fasted. And I have some theories on this, which I could kind of go into, but basically it's further pressed my resolve to be sure that people do in fact fast for 12 hours to at least account for that as well.
So the triglycerides, did the triglyceride numbers changed when you were eating at a calorie deficit as opposed to when you were eating beyond satiety?
I was eating beyond satiety at the 10 days plus. So I know for sure it wasn't, that wasn't the likely factor. And I was wearing a continuous glucose monitor the entire time. So I was able to see that, and this was another great revelation in going carnivore. In going carnivore, my protein levels are closer to 35% protein versus closer to, I want to say 20 to 23% when I'm on keto. And yet my glucose was flat. So there wasn't a spike in glucose from having very protein rich meals. But on top of that, from seeing that it was such a flat line, I also got the sense that there wasn't an insulinemic response. I wasn't seeing a rise in insulin like I also hear is very common with high levels of protein. And again, this may be the case at certain thresholds. It may be very individualistic, and this is just my own data. But as you know, I like to go get my own data. That's my thing, right? And in getting my own data, that super flat line suggests to me that there was very little gluconeogenesis, at least in the wake of the meals that I was doing, at least at a pronounced level. And same thing with insulin. There didn't seem to be a pronounced insulin response. So that suggests to me possibly that between that and the lack of the food making into my hindgut, which of course can activate, I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but it also can activate something else that induces an insulin response, that perhaps I just had very low levels of bolus and basal insulin that would be shuttling away the triglycerides. And that's why you had the longer carryover effect. That's kind of my technical answer.
Yeah, because that was the next thing I was going to ask. Is it maybe your body just didn't have the hormonal, apparatus to move energy out of your bloodstream into wherever you were going? What were you doing? Any kind of exercise during this time?
My exercise was relatively limited. I was visiting my family for the holidays, and it was during a relatively snowy time, and there wasn't really. It was brutal cold out as well. So people weren't exactly in the mood to walk around a lot. So we ended up doing a lot of indoor activities. So I didn't really get a lot of exercise. But on top of that, I kind of didn't want to once I discovered this, in that I wanted to play with and replicate it as many times as I could to help determine its origination.
Okay, that's interesting. So in fact, I wonder now if that's one of the helpful adaptations for plant food is if you eat a little bit of plant with your meat, if it allows a little bit of insulin secretion, which moves those triglycerides into into the muscles or into wherever it is they need to go. What was some of the pushback that you were getting? What were some of the people that were saying that you shouldn't eat a carnivorous diet?
Well, of course, it's so funny because I really did start out on much more of a skeptical standpoint in approaching the carnivore diet. And full disclosure, I have friends who are carnivores and I have friends who are vegans. And I think that I've seen good blood work from both sides. I've seen bad blood work as well. But the point is I don't know right at this moment in time that I could say, oh, you know what, this is the one true diet, or for that matter, this is the one diet that definitely doesn't work. Other than diets that are high in refined or very processed foods, I feel like you can make a strong case for that. I've not yet been able to see a diet for which there isn't already some problems with tolerating it, that you can't ultimately work things out. So the bigger question is, what is a nutritionally complete diet? And that gets to kind of the core of your question is, can a carnivorous diet be nutritionally complete? And here's where it gets a little tricky, because part of the problem in determining nutritional completion is how much your body is required to make things that require the ingredients of other things. I like to sometimes think of biochemistry as really just a bunch of tiny recipes working themselves out inside your body, right? And so you need these different ingredients. And a lot of those ingredients that we know you need, we know from one of two ways. We either know them because we've worked it out molecularly where they come from. But another way is when they're absent from a population and then that population has a problem. Scurvy being a great example. The problem is scurvy also being an example. Why is it that carnivores aren't getting rampant scurvy all over the place? Particularly when it's been assumed that vitamin C is absolutely required, and particularly the quantity that's been anticipated. Well, at a minimum, we can say the whole story hasn't been worked out. Never mind, what the explanations are right now. There's some degree with which these recipes that are going on inside your body are adaptive, and we just don't know what level of true nutritional needs we have to meet when we have these entirely new metabolic pathways that are being opened up by, for example, diets that are predominantly fat-based. We've not really walked down this paradigm in the modern age, and now we are. So I will say I am a little bit skeptical about attacking the carnivore diet and saying it's nutritionally incomplete until we can actually know those endpoints. Until we can really know those cofactors that are absolutely required to move to the next step.
Right.
We just don't know. It's uncharted territory.
Yeah, and what would we? And this is part of the issue that I have, is that there's so much that's not known. Well, I've only got one body. I'm not willing to subject it to a lot of the stuff that you're willing to subject yours to. I was 400 pounds just a couple of years ago. I'm trying to make it to 80 or 90 or 100. I don't want to do some weird experiment that the next 5 years off the end of my life. I want to try to. I'm doing this for a specific reason. I have no interest in furthering scientific thought. I just want to make it to as many birthdays as I can get. So it interests me when people like you are out there doing weird things, because I want to see your results. But I would have to see a lot of people do something before I would subject myself to it. In fact, I saw, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe she was kidding, but I saw that Siobhan started doing a raw carnivore diet. Is that a fact?
That's correct. She did it for a week. Goodness. And she's actually she actually adopted some portion of her food to still be raw. She's even considering repeating the experiment, possibly for an even longer period of time.
See, that's something else that I'm just like, I don't know. It just seems
Here-
absolutely bizarre.
and this is something we have in common. So it's true. There's a number of things I'm willing to do. A lot of people aren't, but I am of the same opinion. There's something called high liver, which is really just highly fermented liver, which other people could just call rotted.
Rotten? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I've had a number of people going, "Yeah, you got to try this, Dave," and I'll concede. I'm not comfortable right now doing that. If I if I got food poisoning, who could I blame? I'd be like, "Oh yeah, so everybody else who was talking me into doing this didn't seem to be fine," but it turned out that sample size was like 5 people.
Right.
So I happen to be the one which turned out to have a problem. I would be annoyed with myself that I tried it when I was already uncomfortable with it to begin with.
I watched a YouTube video one time of a traditional Norwegian woman making the rotten shark that that is that her people ate growing up. I was like, forget this. I mean, this is terrible. And it was just rotten shark. And she fermented it for a little while and ate it, and no, not for me. There's certain things I'm willing to do, certain things I'm not willing to do. So the you did two different carnivore experiments, and refresh my memory. What did you change between them, or did you just take a break between the two different experiments?
There was a break between the two, and I ended up bouncing back to try. So let me kind of set this up a little bit more. The first carnivore experiment, because of my having to kind of go off the track, I decided for the last 5 days I would eat to my baseline diet. What I mean by that is that's a very structured diet where I'd be eating at 10 a.m., 3 p.m., and 8 p.m. And technically it was all animal sourced products, but I was going to go ahead and at the tail end of this, turn that into the control for a 4-day experiment to follow that I was doing for Paul Mason. And what I was doing was I was trying out having added dextrose for 4 days. That could be a podcast in and of itself. But what happened then was following that dextrose experiment, there really ended up being some lingering side effects. I had very intense sweetness cravings. Oh, yeah. Like I never had post an experiment. In fact, I've done a number of experiments where, particularly in the last year, I've introduced and then abandoned carbs in a very controlled way. And this was the very first time in which it had a lingering behavioral aspect that really lingered with me a lot, to where I wanted to go ahead and do another carnivore experiment, both so that I'd be doing a fresh new one with the intent to have it closer to what I originally was trying to do, but also to reset, because I found myself having a whole lot of not actual sweets, but say keto junk food sweets.
Yeah.
And my cravings for them were really off the charts. Like it really was concerning me that dextrose experiment had such a profound effect. But once again, this is something that I guess I get a nice perspective on that a lot of people don't. When you fall off the wagon from your diet, it's usually in some kind of an uncontrolled situation. You're going to visit the family for the holidays. You're at some company luncheon and you're feeling a lot of pressure, and then it happens. But you sometimes associate it with the stressors at the time mentally rearranging you to then break the commitment, and now you just need to get mentally back on track. You almost never have a situation where people are like, no, I'm exactly committed to this baseline, and now I'm going to intentionally add this intervention, and let's see what happens when I then do that and then stop. Because I'm doing almost like a controlled cheat, if you will.
Right.
But I get to actually observe in myself what's happened to my behavior. And without question, I feel that there are some brain chemistry changes that can happen. And I'm learning which ones are more profound than others. The dextrose experiment was surprisingly a lot worse than, say, the white bread and processed meat experiment that I did last year, which had much more carbs. and it was white bread. It was plenty. It was a whole lot moving through my system, a whole lot of glucose moving through my system.
Right.
But something about the refined dextrose in particular turned out to be worse for its aftermath. And I could only know that from having introduced it in such a controlled way. So I know it wasn't a stress catalyst.
Because of the lack of fiber, you think?
Possibly it could have been just ultimately this faster absorption. I mean,
right.
White bread does absorb fairly quickly, but it's true. Candy, especially candy that you're going to consume over like say 10, 15 minutes. I did consume it at a faster overall rate and probably absorbed it at a faster overall rate in the small intestine. The other aspects are you don't have as much of the, as I like to call it, GI discussion coming back. And then there's one other factor, which is the added dextrose was on top of existing fatty meals as part of the baseline. So the white bread and processed meat was at least a swap. I swapped out the fat to bring in the carbs. And I do find that that's very relevant. So like if anybody's watching this now and they're even ever considering cheating on something that's very carby, my 2 cents is, okay, but in that same meal, subtract the fat. Go carbs, don't go fat, or you get the worst of both worlds.
What happened to your triglycerides when you took the dextrose?
I'd have to look. It seemed to me it wasn't too bad, which wouldn't have surprised me. And the reason for this is because given my research, if you have a hole to fill, if you will, in your glycogen stores, mm-hmm. then for a period of time, you're not going to see a pronounced increase in triglycerides.
Okay.
That's because you're not activating.
Well, I was thinking it was going to go down, since it was 220 when you were just doing carnivore, when you did carnivore plus dextrose, I was thinking that the added insulin would move the triglyceride out of the bloodstream into muscle or fat cells, and where the energy would be where it would need to go. I was thinking that the triglyceride levels would be lower specifically because your body had that hormone that it needed to move triglycerides out of the bloodstream.
It does. No. I agree with that. Where it gets tricky is like in the case of the white bread and processed meat experiment, I hit an overage point where my glycogen stores were clearly topped off, and now I'm almost certainly activating de novo lipogenesis because I have like no fat that I'm bringing in from the diet. Yet we're slowly seeing my triglycerides go up and up and up and up and up. So it's whether or not you hit that overage point that truly matters.
Okay. All right, man. Well, there's a lot there. So, okay, there's so many things I want to talk to you about. I want to get into Peter Attia, but I also want to just talk about cholesterol in general now, because every time I have somebody that with cholesterol on, I think people like to hear about our carnivore experiments and everything, but there's a whole bunch of people that are maybe new to the ketogenic diet or less than a year into it, and they just want to know, when I see my cholesterol do X, should I be worried? And I think that maybe you're in a position to kind of at least give us your opinion on this. So let me give you. I just had 3 days ago. I just had a cholesterol test, and this is pretty common for what people I think in our ketogenic world see: high total cholesterol, high HDL, low LDL, and I can give you exact numbers, but high LDL. And that's the one that people always tend to freak out a little bit about. So total cholesterol, 273, HDL, 88, triglycerides, 89. So my HDL trig ratio is 1-to-1, which, I don't know that I could ask for much better than that. LDL cholesterol, 166. And the doctor said, hey, we'd like to get that under 130. How about a statin? I've politely refused at this point. I don't think that I'm going to do that because all the other markers look fine. I'm not worried about high LDL cholesterol. So what is it that you've learned about these different numbers? What do we need to be looking at? And my doctor didn't even test, like, I don't know if I'm in pattern A or pattern B. I assume I'm in pattern A, but that doesn't show up in the test. Things like ApoE, ApoE, these are things that aren't showing up on the test, and I know these are becoming more and more important to look at, and they correlate strongly or less strongly with cardiovascular disease. What do we need to know about a cholesterol test, and what correlates with health or cardiovascular disease that you've seen?
Well, so the good news is that for me personally, I've come to find more and more that 90% of what I really want to know is in a basic lipid panel. The very
Okay,
numbers you just mentioned to me now.
great.
Certainly with my own blood work, I get a what's known as a nuclear magnetic resonance test, which is a centrifuge test. They really break out the particles. They give you the different subtypes, et cetera. I find that actually it's really not that useful as I once thought it was when you have the basic lipid panel in the first place, because the vast majority of people who are on a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet who see their cholesterol numbers go up, they're going to find that their LDL-C is concordant with their particle count, LDL-P. In other words, probably 85, 90%, this is not hyperbole, probably 85 to 90%-ish of people who have, say, an LDL-C of whatever the number is. Let's say you said yours was 166.
166. Yeah, and LDL-C, just so we're talking about the same, LDL-C is calculated versus LDL-P is something else. What is that?
Correct. LDL-C is a calculated number, but it's actually a fairly reliable one so long as your triglycerides and HDL and or HDL aren't in way outrageous ranges.
Okay.
Is about the best way I could put it. What I mean by that is LDL-C, I could take the LDL-C, the calculated LDL-C you gave me right now. Mm-hmm. I could multiply it times 10, and then your LDL particle count will be that number plus or minus around 15%. Like okay. That's pretty much the concordance I'm speaking to, right? So we could get you an NMR, but we'd probably get those results back. And what we'd probably care more about in that is something called small LDL-P, right, which is often referred to as small dense LDL particle count, although put a little asterisk there, that's not exactly accurate. The problem with that is that too is probably going to be somewhere around 25-30% of your LDL-P or less, or even much less, to where it's like immeasurably low. But it's almost certainly not going to be more than that percentage because your triglycerides are low. Your triglycerides are under 100, which is where I want everybody to be, including my family. And your HDL cholesterol is above 50. Those two markers, HDL and triglycerides, are what I've found to be by far the most important markers that you could be looking at in a lipid panel. And I'm not saying that as just, flippantly as, hey, I just kind of like these. It's actually a very evidence-based position. I've really been not just exploring with our own research, but also in pushing it around online and with other lipidologists to say, look, can you give me any studies at all that group all three of these together for which LDL predominantly rules and is far outclasses the other two? And it's not even a close comparison, not even close. HDL and triglycerides, when taken together, are a far more relevant marker for risk, particularly cardiovascular disease risk, and all-cause mortality. Your all-cause mortality is just incredibly improved if you get your HDL up and your triglycerides down. Now, there's one little caveat I want to put in there. If you're somebody who's listening, you've gone on a ketogenic diet, and you found that your HDL bumped up a little bit, but not by a lot, it is true that there can be a genetic influence when it comes to HDL. And that also, by the way, applies if you've always had very high HDL, and then you find that it didn't move that much going on a ketogenic diet. So I do want to fit in that one caveat, but I do feel very strongly about triglycerides. I ideally want people to have their triglycerides below 100. You'll find people who are very athletic and on a ketogenic diet will get it below 70 because, as I was talking about a little bit earlier, it's surprising to find that there's a lot of it in the blood at any given time, especially if it's a fasted blood test, if it's 12 hours fasted.
Okay. So so my understanding here is that as that, trig to HDL ratio goes up, mine's 1-to-1, but you want it to be less than 2-to-1 because that seems to be kind of the hard line. As that ratio goes up, your triglycerides are going way, way up. Your HDL cholesterol is going way, way down. The LDL cholesterol levels seem to be more closely correlated with cardiovascular disease. Is that what you're saying?
I have yet to actually find something that when you take all three of them together mean that the LDL level is causative towards, and I'm very careful with the term causative. Let me just put it this way. You're familiar with Tim Russert, right?
Tim, yeah. In fact, I had Ivor Cummings on a couple weeks ago, and we actually discussed him in at length, and because he's an interesting case, and he's someone that everybody knows, everybody my age, and your age knows.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, cases like his have been shared with me multitudes of time. In fact, Ted Naiman has shared many cases for which LDL was well under 100, the triglycerides were high,
yep,
HDL was low, and they suffered a heart event, right?
Right.
It's not getting LDL really low while the other two parts of the triad are showing something known as it's actually got a name, atherogenic dyslipidemia. Atherogenic dyslipidemia is where you have low HDL, high triglycerides, and a high preponderance of small, dense LDL particles, which, by the way, you almost certainly have if you have low HDL and high triglycerides. So that, again, it's sort of like I don't want to say, a lot of people want to say LDL is meaningless. And I'm not at the point where I can say LDL is meaningless. I am at the point where I can say there are clearly some markers that are far more relevant.
Okay.
And markers I certainly care a lot about for both myself and my family. And without question, HDL and triglycerides are those markers. So if your HDL and your triglycerides look great, whether your LDL is low or high, I probably don't care. Okay. If those markers look bad, whether your LDL is high or low, I probably don't care. So that hopefully that kind of sets it up a little bit more as to why it's more about, where the focus is, where the spotlight is.
Yeah, exactly. Now, does total cholesterol, that big number, without everything broken out, does the total cholesterol correlate with anything? Like, can we tell if someone just said, "Hey, my cholesterol is 250"? Is there anything that we can know about that person?
Well,
or actually, let's say it like this: my cholesterol is 600, 700, 800. They're an outlier. Is there anything that we can tell about them?
Well, usually if your total cholesterol is 6, 7, 800 before you've started a low carb diet, it is likely that you have something known as familial hypercholesterolemia, which is genetically higher levels of cholesterol, and almost certainly the version of FH, as they would call it, where you have mutated LDL receptors. Now, that said, let's say that you didn't. Let's say that before that period of time, you went ahead and you had normal-ish looking numbers, and then you went on a ketogenic diet, and then it shot up to those levels. I'd be willing to bet you were probably lean and athletic and very, very low carb, because that's something we see in a phenotype I like to call lean mass hyperresponders.
Yeah. Okay. That is those people, those lean mass hyperresponders, when their total cholesterol goes up, is there something they should do to modify their diet? Should they switch over to more monounsaturated fats like olive oil or what? And the reason I'm asking that is because we're going to talk about Peter Tia here in a minute. Peter Tia actually gave a case study of somebody who did exactly that, did exactly what they were obviously the lean mass hyperresponder, and he began to adjust his low carb diet to have far more monounsaturated fat as opposed to saturated fat, specifically to get his total cholesterol numbers down. Is that something that those people should think about? Obviously, it's a very small percentage of people, but.
Well, first things first, I should emphasize I'm careful not to say shoulds. Okay. A lot of times people will say, should I worry, things along those lines. My 2 cents is I will give you the research and everything that I know as I understand it. 2, I will try to provide you what information I have for you to meet whatever your goals are. So some people do want to, as you talked about, the lean mass hyperresponders, many of them will say, what's the best way for me to get my LDL down? I really don't care about anybody else's position. I want to help them with that as much as I can. But then finally, we're all on our own health journey.
Right.
I can share how I feel. And how I feel about, those numbers are going to depend a lot on the other markers. And many of those markers I just mentioned to you. On that podcast with Atia, I was feeling a little uncomfortable with the case that he was presenting to me at the time. As you know, I'd mentioned in looking down on the labs, there were a lot of higher inflammatory markers. For example, LPPLA2 was higher than I had ever seen for anybody who had submitted labs to me. Triglycerides were a little elevated as well. I want to say it was like in the 120s or something along those lines. And so I myself would have wanted to dig a little bit deeper and find out a little bit more. Now, that said, I have family members who fit this lean mass hyperresponder profile. And for those who don't already know it, let me just mention real quick. The cut points are an LDL of 200 or higher, an HDL cholesterol of 80 or higher, and triglycerides of 70 or lower. And the reason I called it lean mass hyperresponder when I wrote the article 2 years ago was it seemed as if predominantly these ended up being people who were just tended to be fit and lean. It just worked out that way. And of course, very low carb. So I myself, me personally, me speaking for Dave Feldman, I think knowing what I know to this point, I think I would be perfectly comfortable having that profile, possibly indefinitely. But again, my opinion moves with the data. If it turns out that in studying lean mass hyperresponders, they do show higher cardiovascular risk, then I change my opinion on that. Now, all of that said, we do have a Facebook group where many of them are there. They're sharing their data. And granted, with the caveat that there's some self-selection here, we do push for everybody to be very upfront on both positive and negatives. In fact, I myself have started a thread on any possible negative effects that they felt. But on top of that, I've encouraged them to share things like their carotid intima media thickness tests, CAC tests, and to be sure to keep this ongoing data forthcoming. And if anybody runs into any problems, sudden rise in, say, xanthomas or anything like that that we would associate with people who had FH, to bring that information forward, because we're all kind of discovering this together.
Before I get into Peter T, I did want to ask you about statins real quick. So, is there any because cardiovascular disease does seem to be more closely correlated with the HDL and triglyceride numbers, and less so to LDL numbers, because statins play with the LDL numbers specifically? Is that the reason why everyone is obsessed with LDL? Because we actually have a drug that adjusts LDL, and we don't have a drug, or not to my knowledge at least, that adjusts both HDL and triglycerides. Is that why we are all obsessed with LDL, or is this the tail wagging the dog, or is this based on old information that we thought it was LDL, but now we kind of know it's not? What happened there?
Short answer, yes. So
well,
if there was so you may want to hear about something known as CETP inhibitors, and Peter and I touched on them just briefly in the podcast. That's short for cholesterol ester transfer protein. And what happens is if you inhibit their activity, you have an outcome where you see HDL rise and LDL drop.
Okay.
And that was very exciting because it was well known up to that point that higher levels of HDL are correlated with better health outcomes. And the reason this is kind of a sad story to me is when these drugs continued to fail, when people who were taking them ultimately were just dying a lot more, they then went after HDL to say, you know what, this actually turns out this is not that great of a marker. As though all of the prior studies, all of that prior evidence, we're talking decades worth, was suddenly invalid. Because here was this drug that changed the marker, and it changed the marker by manipulating chemically the lipid system. That was now something to help throw the baby out with the bathwater. And now we should get back to focusing on LDL, because LDL was something for which there was a pharmacological solution to. Well, look, let me just cut to the chase on this, because I try to avoid discussion on statins and cholesterol-lowering medication, because I generally just don't want to take a position on it, because I can't trust the data in a positive or negative way. It has a natural selection bias that's understandable. If you're a business and you're doing, a dozen drug trials, you're going to take the ones to market that are successful. Obviously, that's what you need to do. So the ones that are failing, they can be called failures of their own right. If a drug succeeds at lowering cholesterol, but fails at lowering mortality, well, that's a failed drug. That's not additional information to be added to the pool of LDL lowering making a difference. So only those drugs that ultimately succeed at both lowering LDL and lowering mortality end up making it to market. Well, the problem is then, how can I not sort of feel like we're sort of playing slots at scale, right? Because the majority of atherosclerosis is developed typically before that trial ever began. A trial that lasts, like, say, 2 years, that's not the beginning and end of an atheroma, right? The buildup, and that's part of my problem. My problem is you're looking at a population that has already had some degree of the disease in play. You go ahead and put them onto the drugs, and then you add in one other very unfortunate confounder, in my opinion, that you could set a trial that's, say, 3 years long, and they can stop it short. Apparently, this is something that they're allowed to do, to be able to say, we're going to stop it at 22 months because we feel we've had all the information we need to go ahead and take this drug to market. Well, okay, if you were talking to a potential financial advisor, they said, yeah, all of my numbers look great coming up to June 8th. You're like, well, wait, I want to know how you looked all last year. And be like, no. At June 8th, I was looking great, right? No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to, choose when the mark's high and then say that this is what's reflective of the entirety. So again, the reason I don't like to talk drug trials too often is because they 100% could be great. The problem is that I don't get a complete picture, so I don't get to work with that. So bringing it back to CETPs and HDL, I think there's way more than enough evidence to show just how that association with HDL matters. Now, how much of it is causal, that can be debated for the same reason that how much of it is causal from an LDL side can be debated. And the reason is because I believe it's reflective, that your lipid system is more reflective of the state of your health than it is the other way around, driving the state of your health. And that's why I like to see whatever it is that you're doing, make those markers look better, given how predictive they appear to be.
Okay. All right, well, let's move on to the topic that made me kind of reminded me that I wanted to get you on the podcast was your interview with Peter Attia. And I wish, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I wish that more podcasts did what he did, which is bring on somebody you disagree with, and you guys hash it out. Some of my favorite podcasts were like the one with Joel Kahn and what's his name over in California, I forget his name. Kresser. Right. On Joe Rogan. I thought that was an amazing podcast, and it really showed, the weaknesses of the vegan position when you see him, in contrast like that. There's another one coming up, Tobbs and Guyane, coming up on Joe Rogan. I'm looking forward to, like you wouldn't believe. But your conversation with Peter Attia on this subject of what exactly cholesterol is and what it's doing, I thought was just as helpful and just as interesting. So can you tell us what Attia's position was and where the two of you disagree? Like, what was the crux of the issue that you guys were arguing about?
So you want me to boil a 3.5-hour podcast down to a paragraph or two?
Let's just pick one, because he picked three, right? He picked three main subjects, and he kind of gave a couple paragraphs at the beginning of why he disagreed. So let's just pick one of the big one, which was I don't have it here in front of me, but there seemed to be one that you didn't they didn't account for the mass of these different particles. So where was the mass coming from? And I have to be honest with you, when you guys were unpacking that, I, number one, didn't understand what the relevance was, and number two, I didn't understand why like, what was the difference? Who cares? It comes from somewhere, the body's complicated. And so I didn't understand what was being talked about there. So let's just go with that. And maybe we'll hit the second one if we have time. But what was being said there, and why was the divergence between your two positions relevant to overall health or cholesterol numbers or anything like that?
Well, so first of all, as always, I like to extend that I'm very thankful that I was on his podcast. I really appreciate it.
It was great. I mean, it was fantastic.
And if I could also further just add to your original point, I really do feel that some of the best, most evidentiary moments for me is when I get to watch things in a debate. So I could not encourage it more. I would be on any number of podcasts I could be on to test my energy model in the same way. I would love it if I could, find another X number of TIAs or other lipidologists who also had podcasts, but there's not really a lot of them. So yes, to your point, to be perfectly honest, of the three things he brought up in his pre-buttal, that was at the beginning, and of the areas that we got stuck on, I will concede the mass balance one is actually probably one of the least interesting for me, but I can explain it really quickly. Basically, the gist of it is that he was interested in where it was that all of this cholesterol that found its way into the blood, that, say, Craig Moffat, who is our example that we kept talking about, would see a level that was, say 3 times higher than somebody on a normal level of cholesterol, a quote unquote normal degree of cholesterol. And he was suggesting that perhaps it's because it's synthesizing it more. In fact, I think I asked him that directly. Do you think Craig's actually synthesizing 3 times more per day? Right. And this is where the concept of mass goes. Where does the mass of those cholesterol molecules being found in these lipoproteins going? And I did actually answer this a number of times in the podcast. I was saying, well, as far as I know, the liver can recirculate cholesterol as many times as it wants. And since that podcast, I've looked into it. I know of no way in which there is a rate limitation of use for cholesterol in the body. In fact, on the contrary, it's probably one of the most passed around molecules there are because of how greedy the body is with it. It's very expensive to make. There's like 30 steps in synthesizing cholesterol. In fact, statins work by inhibiting one of those steps, the HMG co-reductase. So here I'm going to go ahead and use just a racetrack because this seems to be the easiest way to get it across to lay people. If I were to say, what is the mass balance of an empty racetrack, we could say it's 0. And let's say that I add a race car. Well, the mass balance change is now 1 race car, right? Okay. And then it circles and then it exits. Now the mass balance has changed and that it's 1 less race car. Okay. So now let me go ahead and add 10 race cars. Now there's been a mass balance change of 10 race cars. But the race cars keep making loops. They keep making laps inside the track. And we now take one of those race cars off. The mass balance change was 1 race car, leaving 9 race cars still making the laps, right? So if I wanted to increase those race cars on the circuit by, let's say, 3 race cars, all I have to do is add 3 race cars. And now there'll be 12, if you've been following the math up to this point. There's 12 race cars in circulation, but I've only added 3, right? Okay. Now I could put a race car in and out of that track, and the mass balance change has only been 1 race car at a time, even though more race cars are on there in that moment. And that's what I'm saying is, unless there's a fixed amount of time that a race car is allowed to be on a track, then there's no way you could know what the mass balance is by looking at the track in a snapshot. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in blood glucose, we have the HbA1c that measures the glycation of our blood cells, but that that number is predicated on our blood cells only being in the body for 90 days. There's nothing like that for cholesterol. There's no reason why any particular cholesterol marker could be in the blood for 10 minutes versus, 3 months. Is
That's
that
correct.
what you're saying? Okay.
That's exactly right.
Okay. So we don't have a way of knowing the rate at which new cholesterol particles are formed or the rate at which more old cholesterol particles are cleared out.
That's right. Now,
Okay.
I'll go ahead and segue into his more interesting point, and I think the most salient one, probably the most controversial one because it's kind of core to my energy model, which is why do people who are lean and fit like Craig Moffat and these lean mass hyperresponders, why would they see such an extraordinarily pronounced higher level of LDL cholesterol? And to do that, I want to work my way backwards.
Okay.
LDL particles, the ones that carry this LDL cholesterol, can and often do start out as a precursor known as VLDLs, very low density lipoproteins. And very low density lipoproteins are bloated up with these triglycerides, and triglycerides are fat-based energy. The reason I like to see your triglycerides low is it suggests that you're correctly using them. And that's very relatable to glucose. You don't want to see your glucose high for the same reason. Your body, if your glucose is high, it suggests it's having a tough time using it or putting it away. It's the same thing with triglycerides, but the difference between triglycerides and glucose is triglycerides are on these boats. Well, VLDLs, these particular boats, they are associated with higher cardiovascular disease in that if you have a bunch of them, then it suggests that you're having trouble making use of them. And if you're having trouble making use of them, usually you're already in a hyperinsulinemic state. You have high levels of insulin and so forth, right?
And you're in a hyperinsulinemic state because you're eating more carbs. More carbs means higher blood sugar. The body prefers to use blood sugar for fuel as opposed to fat. So you have these big fat pieces of fat running around your body. There's no place to put them because the body is preferentially using sugar, correct?
I would say I would agree on the second part. I don't necessarily agree on the first part because you have to first get to your personal fat threshold to get to the second part. So you could absolutely be on a carb-centric diet and be fine as long as you can process the carbs well, like you're not truly insulin resistant and so forth. So long as, like me with the white bread experiment, you're not getting to the overage point. Because I got to the overage point, now I have more de novo lipogenesis, et cetera. So reeling it back to the VLDLs being central to this theory, the idea is that the reason these people have higher LDL, yet very low triglycerides found in the blood, is because they are actually trafficking more of these VLDLs for repletion of their fat stores and to provide energy to their non-fat tissue. So basically, they're being used a lot more for energy. There's more turnover of triglycerides back into their tissues at a higher rate. So a good analogy, a lot of people like this analogy, is imagine we're at a port and the harbor is full of boats and I can spot like 100 boats and we're out looking at them. I'm like, oh, that's way too many boats. You shouldn't need that many boats to deliver the cargo. And you say, oh, now hold on, Dave, let's watch the boats. Let's see what happens. And we see that they're going out wherever they go, but they come back and they're empty, right? And you go, now hold on, Dave, it looks as if they're meeting whatever demand there is for wherever they're going because they're successfully dropping off their cargo and returning. And then we go back a week later and there's 1,000 boats. And I'm like, okay, that's definitely this is way too many boats. And you go, now hold on, Dave, let's watch. And sure enough, they go out and they come back empty. So there's a lot more empty boats, but that's okay. The empty boats indicate that they're just at a higher demand for shipping their cargo. That's what I contend is going on as the reason you see higher LDL cholesterol and therefore higher LDL particles with people who are fat adapted, who are obviously trafficking more of this fat-based energy triglycerides. But the reason so much of it's not showing up in the blood is because there's faster turnover and use. And Peter's second prebuttal point, which I believe had to do with this, was that if I'm making the case that people who are lean mass hyperresponders are observing higher LDL because they are actually trafficking higher VLDL, the precursor, that he would expect to see they would test with higher VLDL and they would test with higher triglycerides in the blood. But that assumes that there's a fixed rate of turnover of the triglycerides. And I haven't been able to get a chance to truly test this yet because it's a much more difficult thing to actually test secretion and turnover. But I'm working my way towards it.
Well, that seems like this seems like the crucial point of difference was just this idea of cholesterol being cleared out at a steady rate, which is kind of what he was suggesting, versus your point of, we can recycle these particles almost indefinitely. What was he basing his position on? If there's no reason to think that cholesterol gets cleared out or made at a consistent rate, why was he have an issue with your theory? Where was he coming up with that idea?
I think, to be fair to Peter, I've met now lots of lipidologists. I've kind of talked through the model here and there. This is kind of a new paradigm. It's sort of hard to think about cholesterol numbers shifting with the tides of metabolic energy management. It really is. It's a whole new. I kept thinking very early on, very naively, that everybody who is into low carb and everybody who is into lipidology would very quickly grasp this in the way that I was presenting it. And at a minimum, even if they disagreed with it, they would first see what I was trying to say and then come back at it from another direction. And the bottom line is that's just not the case. It takes a series of conversations with the most stalwart, low carb, anti-lipid lowering fan of my work. It takes a while to really absorb that. No, actually, this is more about energy distribution, and cholesterol is kind of almost a tracer at the end of this energy distribution chain. And that's before I say, and it turns out there's these other factors that can further influence cholesterol levels that I am controlling for in my experiments that you have to be aware of. Like, before you can even approach my energy model, you have to be aware LDL particles actually serve many more purposes in the body than people realize. And once you realize that, it now starts to become a little bit clearer, but that takes a while. It takes a while to get that.
Yeah, that was one of the more disturbing, after I got finished listening to it and I was kind of thinking through it, that was one of the more disturbing things I found about his position is what you've really got to believe is that a low carb diet fixes a lot of different things that are wrong with a lot of people. It fixes the insulin levels. It fixes the glucose levels. It fixes the A1C. It fixes all of these different markers for cardiovascular disease. It fixes a ton of stuff all at the same time, except it makes your LDL cholesterol worse, which I'm sure there are probably other examples of something fixing 90 things but making one thing worse. But boy, you're really asking those of us that are kind of on the outside looking in to think that this way of eating fixes all of these different problems that you're seeing people have and are be able to repair with a ketogenic diet or just a low carb diet, except this one outlier of LDL cholesterol goes up, and that's what we need to be afraid of, and that's what we need to be concerned with. It just seemed, honestly, it just seems silly. I'm not willing to make that assumption. If I'm wrong, well, I'm wrong. Well, go ahead.
I'll defend Atia and others in that what I think he would say in this spot is he'd be like, no, that's great. You do want to actually have all of those things, but why not be even better and bring down the LDL as well? Since the LDL is this independent risk factor on top of it, why not get all of those benefits from low carb and consider taking,
a statin,
low dose amount or something along those lines to come with it. And me trying to be a good scientist, he could be right. It could turn out that truly is, all things being equal, all the benefits that I've gotten low carb, I go on it, And if the only thing we're different in, the sliding doors parallel universe is this other version of me took a low dose statin, that version of me would live longer. But this is the thing that I was bringing up also in the same podcast is part of the problem is you have to acknowledge something that I think is not widely acknowledged, which is there are benefits to LDL particles. Siobhan, by the way, has not only written a lot on it, she did a great breakout presentation at Keto Fest from last year called LDL Prime to Protect. And she goes into many of the different aspects that are valuable of LDL particles and are worth mentioning. But the main thing is, and the reason why I always bring this back to all-cause mortality is there a trade-off? Are you trading off in lowering LDL some things that would be beneficial that would actually mean you'd have the same or even greater longevity? And my short answer to that is it's not yet clear, but there sure is a lot of evidence that I think shouldn't be ignored. For example, you were mentioning total cholesterol earlier. There are a lot of studies that predate the statin age that definitely looked a lot more towards total cholesterol and all-cause mortality. And there's some even since then that show that those people who have a greater overall total cholesterol actually have lower all-cause mortality, particularly women. Women, it's almost stepwise. It's like an X graph. The lower their LDL is, the worse their all-cause mortality. And that's a concern to me because I feel like they don't stratify very often for women. And when they do, It shows this benefit. For men, it's a little more of a U curve potentially, but that's part of the problem with that is the highest end of the curve is on the left side where you have the lowest LDL. So these are in fact associative. It's not necessarily causal, but that said, it should be taken in light with the same evidence as everything else that's associative. So again, short answer, it's not quite clear, but until I feel like there is something that can actually better establish that, I have a problem taking that as the gospel.
Yeah. Okay. So last question. At the end of your interview with Peter Attia, he challenged you to stop going to low carb conventions and start going to lipidology conventions. Is that something that you feel like you should do, or do you have?
I've done it twice.
You've done it twice. Okay.
Yes.
And what was the reception?
Well, first of all, actually, hardly anybody knew me.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, let me put it this way. The very first one I went to was just before Peter's podcast had actually aired.
Okay.
And by the way, to Peter's credit, he actually offered to straight up pay my way into that first conference. Okay. I had initially thought I would accept, and then I ended up having to turn it down for a very ironic reason. I wanted to be able to have the freedom to speak highly of Attia without people second guessing that it was because he paid my way into the lipidology conference. So all of the compliments I given Attia during this podcast, you can be sure are genuine.
Okay.
But no, the second time around, to my surprise, because I thought it'd be the same as the first time around, 4 different people approached me and said that they were fans of my work, which really shocked me. Those 4 different people, though, weren't lipid luminaries. They weren't like very highly placed. They were medical doctors that were just getting their board certification for lipidology and so forth. But even so, that was kind of surprising to me. I was actually, I wasn't expecting it, particularly given how things went the first time around.
Well, if your idea has merit, I would expect it to have merit with the younger generation of doctors first, as opposed to, Thomas Dayspring's never going to agree with you. In fact, like I said, I'm going through his talk on Peter Attia, and there's a couple times when the disdain, you're not mentioned by name, but the disdain for people who believe what you believe is literally dripping, off of his words. And so, you're not going to convince him, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if you made an inroad into the next generation of doctors. And that old saying about science progressing one funeral at a time, it's a terrible saying, but a lot of times it's true. You've got to go after the young bucks, as it were. So that's encouraging. That's encouraging, I would think.
At the end of the day, I think we're all on team. Let me restate that. At the end of the day, I think we're all on team science.
Yeah.
And I like to think that nothing ultimately is the better argument than data itself. When the data is there and it's clear and it's in front of us, then that's what ends up mattering the most. And that's what I want to pursue. I want to get the strongest, clearest data that can answer these tough questions for all of us.
Right. Okay. Well, I've kept you longer than I said I would, so I apologize. But if you could tell my listeners where they could, contact you, follow you, all of the cool stuff that you're doing, I would appreciate that.
Sure. You can, of course, find me at cholesterolcode.com. I'm also very active on Twitter, at Dave Keto. And for those people who are also on Facebook, we have a Cholesterol Code Facebook group. You can just search Cholesterol Code. Or for that matter, if you're a lean mass hyperresponder like described earlier, we have a specific group for lean mass hyperresponders, which you can also find on Facebook.
Okay, perfect. All right, guys, we're going to put links to all of that in the show notes. So, Dave, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's fantastic. All right, guys, those of you that are listening, hold on. We'll be right back with some more information.